Missing from the list.
I'm encyclopedia in humanities. It is straight because it's like it's COHORTS based in the humanities, but it's all medical school. So it's like, I mean, it's great that you can still prove it's not after wedding. It's not
just shout if you need it.
Welcome everybody. It's with great pleasure on behalf of the Department of Science and Innovation and the National Research Foundation Center of Excellence in Human Development here at BITS to welcome you to the Cohorts Symposium. It's quite remarkable how time flies, and you'll hear a lot about time today because these studies have been incubating and working and continuing for many, many years. So firstly, this is a group of low middle income country birth cohorts that were assembled to form a team called Cohorts, a consortium. And this consortium has been going for almost 15 years, remarkably. We were just doing the math earlier this morning. And so this morning, you're going to hear a little bit about each of the cohorts. And then towards the end, you're going to hear some of the really remarkable analyses we've been doing on this group of birth cohorts. And there'll be plenty time for questions and answers. So you've got notepads, you've got pens. So as you hear anything that strikes your interest that you want to follow, please make a note. We're going to do it in a series, so you're going to hear all the cohorts, talk a little bit of introduction to each of the cohort studies and some key outstanding results. And then we're going to reflect on some of the new analyses just very recently completed on this consortium. And then we're going to open up for questions and answers. So please do make your notes, questions as we go along, and then we'll have time at the end. So it's with great pleasure we welcome Ana Menezes, a professor from Pilatus in Brazil. And Ana will talk to us about the cohorts, various cohorts in Pilatus, but in particular the 1993 birth cohort. Ana.
Well, good morning. Thanks a lot for this invitation to Shane, Linda. Thanks to Ari, who is coordinating this big project. It's a pleasure to be here. I think Brazil and South Africa have several similarities. Then I feel like at home here. I'm sorry about my English, not very good. But if I speak in Portuguese, you'll not understand anything. Then it's a little bit better to speak in English. Please feel free to stop me at any time and to try to answer in the meantime if you want. I'm going to talk about our cohorts from Pelotas, a city in Brazil. The objectives, methodology, main impact results, and dissemination. I will focus mainly today in the impact results. And the results from our cohorts, I will talk about this tomorrow. That's Brazil. And we live here in this very small city named Pelotas. As you can see, our population is not very big. We are a poor city. In the first cohort, we are richer than we are now. At the moment, we have an infant mortality rate around 13.8, and it was in 1982 about 36 per thousand. Then it was a success to have the infant mortality reduced in the meantime. And we have 4 birth cohorts in Pelotas. Pelotas is an outlier city, you know, very small city, poor place, but we have 4 birth cohorts. The first one was in 1982, then the second one 11 years later, and then the third one 2004, and the new one 2015. As you can see here, the births were almost 6,000 in 1982, And now, by 2015, we have around 4,000 birds. Then in the total, we have nearly 20,000 people who we have been following since 1982. The fertility in Pelotas decreased by 44%. The birth rate fell from 23 to 13 birds for 1,000, despite an increase of 50% in our population. The general objectives for the 4 bird cohorts are to evaluate temporal trends of maternal and child indicators through the lifespan by comparing results of the 4 bird cohorts, and to assess the association between early exposures and outcomes during the life course. The perinatal study methodology is we followed all children born between the 1st of January to the 31st of December in all these years. We saw these women at the hospitals. We have 5 hospitals in the city of Pelotas. Then daily we're checking the hospitals for each birth. And mothers living in the urban area. These cohorts are from the urban area of Pelotas. These are the 5 main hospitals in the city. In the first cohort, we visited only 4 hospitals because we had only 4. Now I will give an example of the 1993 cohort, the main follow-ups, which is similar to the other cohorts. Then that's the beginning of the cohort, the perinatal study. Then we had 5,200, around 200 birds. Then we had a follow-up at 1 month and at 3 months. But we didn't have enough money to see all the people from the perinatal study. Then we saw only a subsample at 1 month and at 3 months. For the 6 months, 1 year, and 4 years, we got a little bit more money, and we increased the subsample from around 600 people to 1,400 people. And all low birth weights were included in these 3 subsamples. And then, at 11 years, 15 years, 18 years and 22 years old, we were able to follow all the cohort, not subsamples anymore, but the whole cohort. We were more rich at this time. We were able to get more funding, okay? That's why we saw all of them. We tried to see all of them. I'm not showing here the response rates, but they are quite high, even at 22 years old. At 22 years old, the response rate was 76%, which is quite good for 22 years after the birth. The main variables collected at birth, which are more or less the same for the whole 4 cohorts, are family variables, socioeconomic and family composition, about the parents' schooling, occupation, skin color, all their reproductive history, about the current pregnancy, smoking, alcohol, social support, disease, health characterization, maternal weight and height. Then during childhood, we're looking at sex, skin color, anthropometry, since the birth. Up to now, we have the very sophisticated body composition measurements, but we are still doing anthropometry. breastfeeding and feeding patterns, intellectual development, physical injuries, morbidity, hospitalizations, medicines, and mortality. Here's some pictures from early childhood. Then the main variables at adolescence up to 30 years old, which is the oldest cohort. Schooling, employment, income, wealth, behavior characteristics, mental health, well-being, emotional recognition, IQ, sexuality, violence, body composition, clinical assessment, blood pressure, pulse, spirometry, blood and saliva samples, and oral health. For some of these measurements, we have subsamples, like oral health. We didn't see oral health for the whole cohort. Okay. Here you can see some of the pictures. In the first follow-ups of the cohorts, we are looking these people at their households. And now we have a building, we call the research center. Some of you have known our building. And we call people to come to this place and we see the people at this place. Why? Because now we have big equipment and it's impossible to take these equipment to the households. It is worse for the refusal rates because some people don't want to go to this place. When you go to their house, it's easier to see them. They stay in these last follow-ups, they stay in our place like 4 or 5 hours doing all the interviews and all these exams, which is quite a lot of time. And they are working, some of them now, then it's difficult. I'm going to talk a little bit about impact on public health politics. This was one of the main and the first papers from the first cohort, the 1982 cohort, about exclusive breastfeeding and the protection for dying from diarrhea and other infectious diseases like respiratory infections. Most of you know the name of Cesar Victor, and this was one of the first papers, important papers from our cohorts. And then we are able to show that the odds ratio for dying for diarrhea was 14 times more for children who are not breastfed than people who are breastfed. And after that, and after having some global information from Peru, from Philippines on breastfeeding, we, UNICEF and WHO were giving a message, an important message about breastfeeding, about 10 steps on how to breastfeed. And this was very important, I think, for the, not only for Brazil, but for the world. And the result from Brazil is that in 75, the median duration of breastfeeding was just 2 months, 0.5. And 2007, we're able to get a median of 14 months. Now breastfeeding in Brazil is quite common. It was, unfortunately, a very short time of breastfeeding some years ago. But this, of course, was obtained according to multiple levels: policy, enforcement of the code, involvement of the civil society, health worker training, baby-friendly hospitals, which we have in Brazil. I don't know if you have here in South Africa. human and milk banks, which also have now professional associations, workplace, mass media, and communities. Then we had other important achievements after this paper about between the association between breastfeeding and IQ at 30 years old, because it was from the first cohort, the 1982 cohort. And we were able to show the long consequence of breastfeeding. Not only the short consequence, important, but the long consequence as well. Then you can see here the breastfeeding in months duration and the increase in the IQ at 30 years old, and then the increase in years of schooling at this age, and income in our local money here at this age as well. And this analysis were adjusted for a lot of confounding variables, even in this cohort for genomic score, because we have the GWAS for the first cohort. We are doing now GWAS for the second cohort. The analysis has been carried out in England. There was a lot of media about this, breastfeeding and IQ. They are calling pelotas from England, from around the world. We are giving a lot of interviews about this, and this was very important for the policymakers in Brazil. And then the next step was this series, Lancet, from the COHORTS project about maternal and child undernutrition and the consequence in adult health and human capital. You know very well this series. This paper had a very high index of citation. And here it has been shown in the cohorts this 1,000 days, the window of opportunity. Then for the child survival in human capital, the first 1,000 days are quite important, the condition of weight gain, and after that, it's not so important, maybe it's a risk for non-communicable disease. And recently, we have been contacted by the Minister of Health and Social Development Department in Pelotas, in Brazil, to evaluate the impact of this program, Health Children Program. We call in Portuguese, Criança Feliz. This started 2 years ago, and we are still doing the project. It is an ongoing public health intervention, targets families with children receiving the conditional cash transfer program, which we have in Brazil, to increase early learning and stimulation to enhance child-caregiver relationships, safety, and security. The impact assessment of this intervention is going to be in 2021. Then we still don't know how it's going to be the results of this intervention. If it's going to be successful, we hope to have this implemented in the whole country of Brazil. And we have some source of dissemination of results. This is a supplement of this journal with the results of the 4 worked cohorts. Then it has been very nice. We're able to show the main results of the 4 cohorts. We also have each follow-up of each cohort. We have a supplement in this journal as well about the profile update from each follow-up visit. We had our first book on about the first cohort, named Epidemiology of Inequalities. This was many years ago. And now we just published the second book in Portuguese about the results of the 4 cohorts. We also have other types of dissemination. We have our web page, our library, a lot of media information. We call these people through the media, a lot of, on the TV, on the newspaper, in order to get these people coming to visit us in our center. We had a lot of funding from outside Brazil, but we have been funding from the government, from the Brazilian government in the last years as well. Then the last follow-ups visit have been funded by the Brazilian government. And the follow-up visits, we are just starting now at the first cohort at 39 years old, the second cohort at 30 years old, the 2004 cohort at 15 years old, and that's it. A lot of money. Each follow-up visit is very, very expensive. Thanks a lot. And
Thank you very much, Anna. Any burning questions? Any points of clarification?
yes.
Thanks a lot. And a very quick questions, and I don't mind quick answers because I know we need to move on. One was pregnancy in adolescence, pregnancy and childbirth in adolescence, just to give an idea of that over the time span. And the other, if it's relevant, because you've already said some, what were the questions on your minds at the beginning of the cohorts, going back to the 1987? What was the 1 or 2 or 3 most important questions at the origin?
About your first question, pregnancy during teenagers, it is one of the important results from the first cohort to the last one, because it's still not improving. Unfortunately, we still have a lot of pregnancy during teenagers. Tomorrow I'm going to show you these results. Then, of course, mainly among the poor people. Not among the rich people, but among the poor people. Still very high. About the original questions, Cesar Victora and the other PI from our center, Fernando Barros, they did their PhD degree in London, and Patrick Bolden was their supervisor. And they started to know about cohort studies there, doing big epidemiological studies. And when they went back to Brazil, Fernando Barros and Cesar, they decided to do the first cohort. It was like we didn't have anything. We didn't have any special place. We didn't have money, just a small amount of money. And the first cohort started like almost a voluntary job. Okay, we rented a room in a building in the city center. The computers were the very old computers for doing analysis. The computers were running days. Actually, the first cohort, the first visit, were using. I was not working the cohorts at that time. I'm much younger than Cesar and Fernando Barros. They tell me that in the first cohort they were using like cards, cards for and of course the main questions were the mortality, infant mortality, disease during pregnancy, and they didn't think at that time that we would be able to follow these people. Actually, the first cohort, it was like a cross-sectional study, a perinatal study. That was it. And then we decided to do a longitudinal study, and then we decided to do the other cohorts.
Great, well thank you, and we'll have more questions towards the end of the session. So as you can see, a lot of tenacity and goodwill and a lot of perseverance to get these cohorts off the ground. We're now going to hear from Renato Martorell from Emory University. Guatemalan cohort is the oldest cohort in our group, and they've just celebrated their 50th year.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Shane, for inviting me. I'm going to talk about the long-term impact of improved nutrition in the first 1,000 days. And as I outlined there at the bottom, 1,000 days refers to the number of days between conception and 2 years of age. And we're all very grateful to INCAP, the Institute of Nutrition of Central America and Panama, located in Guatemala City. This institution carried out the original longitudinal study and has been involved in all subsequent follow-up studies. The study itself began in 1969 and lasted till 77. And the original question, the driving question of the study was the extent to which supplementation with protein impacted child development, mental development. Measures of physical growth were included as secondary measures simply to verify that the supplement was biologically efficacious. A little bit about design of the study. It was a community randomized supplementation trial with 2 sets of pair villages. 2 villages, one large, one small, received atole, a nutritious supplement, and also one large and one small villages received fresco, a less nutritive drink. And all 4 communities received preventive and curative health care administered by auxiliary nurses under the supervision of a physician. The experiment had an important impact on home dietary intakes. And when you look at the diet that children are consuming at home, and also at how much supplement they're consuming, the total diets, when we compare atole versus fresco, the total diets from atole villages were greater by 9 grams of protein, 100 calories per day, and also in important ways in several micronutrients. So it did have a very important dietary impact. It also impacted physical growth. And here you see the comparison between children at 3 years of age who were exposed to these supplements during their entire lives being compared to children measured in the baseline in 1968. And you see that the communities in atole villages grew about 3 inches taller, whereas in the fresco communities, there was hardly any change. There are many ways of looking at the data. Another one is looking at the percent of children with severe stunting. This is -3 standard deviations below the reference median. You can imagine how much stunting there used to be in these communities. And you see in the blue line for atole that, for fresco, I'm sorry, that this remains more or less stable as you go from the beginning of the study towards the end. but the line in red for atole shows a marked decline. So remember I told you that the purpose of the study was to study impact on mental development. And there were, there was a very rich, eclectic battery of tests. And it was, I joined this study as a student in 1972, and I remember in 1977, the psychologists on the project being somewhat disappointed because they didn't have much to show in terms of clear, consistent impact on child development. Okay. We've gone back to the field several times, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on results from 3 of the follow-up studies. The first one was done in 1988-89 when the former participants were 11 to 27 years of age. The second in 2002-2004 when they were 25 to 42 years of age. And the most recent one at ages 37 to 54. These are the, some findings from the first follow-up study. Adolescents and young adults in atole villages were taller, had greater fat-free mass, and greater work capacity in the case of males than their counterparts in fresco villages. And to our great surprise, performance on tests of knowledge, numeracy, reading, comprehension, and vocabulary were better in atole villages compared to fresco. We didn't expect this given the prior findings. This was confirmed in the later follow-up, where we, in 2002, where we saw an increase of schooling of 1.2 years. The average level of schooling is about 5 years, so this is very significant. Reading and intelligence were improved in important ways. And perhaps the most cited paper from our group linked the intervention to what economists are really concerned, money. And we were able to show that improved nutrition in the first 1,000 days, but this is important, but not later, increases wages in men by 46% and annual incomes by $914. These are poor communities, and at that time, that represented a 33% increase in annual incomes. I show this picture to remind myself to tell you why we didn't see this impact in women. And the reason is that very few of them participated in the labor market. These were very traditional communities in which they stayed at home working, taking care of their many children. So this picture here of these women making bread is kind of unusual. We were interested in tracing the pathway linking improved nutrition to wages. You know, is it brain or is it brawn? And brawn means, you know, is it explained by things like height, strength, cardiovascular endurance, and so on. And brain means, you know, is it explained by intelligence, schooling, and we find very clearly in this analysis that it is through brain. Guatemala has experienced a lot of change, and obesity and related risk factors for cardiovascular disease have increased dramatically. Since we first went to those communities in 1969, and since the first follow-up in 1988-89. So we are interested in finding out, you know, how did this experiment, nutrition experiment, interacted with this major shift in health and diet. And we find a trade-off in terms of chronic diseases. It's not a simple story, it's a trade-off. Atole increased fatness and obesity. It increased body fat and BMI. It doubled the likelihood of obesity. And we're exploring mechanisms, and we think this is because better educational outcomes resulted in greater incomes, in changes in diets, and less physical activity. On the other hand, Atole decreased diabetes. It reduced glucose levels. It reduced the prevalence of diabetes by 50%. And one possible mechanism is that improved nutrition resulted in epigenetic changes that help people tolerate a high sugar and high fat diet. Just a few slides on the contributions of the Guatemalan cohort. It is the first to evaluate the long-term effect of a nutrition intervention. And I think the lesson is that you can't fully learn all about the impact of an intervention if you just look at concurrently at early childhood. There's a lot more that you're going to learn long-term, and the INCAT study is a great example of this. Our study, as well as other studies, helped establish the importance of the first 1,000 days for human capital in productivity. It was very important for a lot of these policies around this concept of the first 1,000 days. But our study also shows that we have to be careful that there may be trade-offs in terms of metabolic diseases. Policy implications. The first is that investments in improving nutrition in the first 1,000 days should be considered long-term economic investments. Long-term economic investments, because they improve human capital and economic productivity. Our findings have been important in influencing the policy of, for example, the World Bank. The argument that you could lend countries money for health and nutrition in early childhood and argue that that's an economic intervention is very important, and our study has provided quite a lot of the evidence for that. We also think that it provides a caution that when we do these improvements in child nutrition, we need to also pay attention to the promotion of healthy diets and active lives across the life course. I thank you very much for listening, and thank you again, Shane, for inviting me.
Thank you. Any questions, just for clarifying purposes? Yes.
Is there any question related to the stuff you were saying?
Yes.
Oh, I wanted to ask.
Okay. Great. Good. So as you can see, the value of these type of cohorts is the study of over the long-term period, and how by truncating that study, you may have come to an erroneous conclusion, and that you really need to play these things out across the life course. We now move to the third cohort from the Philippines, and Nanette Lee will start off the presentation and then hand over to Professor Linda Adair from University of North Carolina. Nanette.
good morning. So I want to introduce you to the Cebu Longitudinal Health and Nutrition Survey. We call it the CLHNS. So in the early 80s, there was this concern in the Philippines about the relationship between infant feeding, morbidity, and child growth. So there was this felt need to have a study or survey that would explore or assess these relationships. So at that time, we had a mayor that is very supportive. He was a medical doctor. So that was one of the reasons why it was conducted in Cebu, this felt need study. So why in Cebu? First, there's research capacity in the presence of the Office of Population Studies of the University of San Carlos. Two, there was, Metro Cebu has both urban and rural barangays which can explore heterogeneity of infant feeding. And of course, third, the political support, which is very important, the political support of the mayor then. So this is the site of the study. Excuse me. This is the map of the Philippines. Cebu, or the island of Cebu, the Cebu province is located at the center of the Philippines. Metro Cebu is the second most populous metropolitan area in the Philippines. That's the violet part, that's Metro Cebu. And from Metro Cebu, we randomly selected 33 barangays, 17 urban and 16 rural barangays. So reflected there as the green and blue ones. So they were randomly selected barangays. The design was based on the Mosley and Chen health determinants model, wherein health outcomes, or at that time child health outcomes, was determined or influenced not just by proximate determinants, but also by underlying determinants, such as socioeconomic, for example, socioeconomic status and community characteristics. So this is a community-based birth cohort. Data was first collected when they were still in their mother's womb, at about 30 months, 30 weeks gestation. The first set of measurements at birth, and then every 2 months over the first 2 years of life. Follow-up surveys were also conducted early childhood, mid-childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, and the latest when they were about 35 years old. Now, the first 2 years was every 2 months. The closely spaced measurements was done because we needed to capture rapidly changing behaviors and outcomes in infants, because it was designed as an infant feeding study. So consistent with the Mosley and Chen framework with distant or underlying and proximate determinants, we collected data from the community, the household, and the individual. So CLHNS has a core set of modules or questionnaires that we administer to all survey rounds, plus then life stage specific questions that we add. So, and the latest survey, for example, we added a battery of mental, cognitive, and social-emotional measures in addition to the usual physical measures that we do. Again, the sample, how was the sample selected? In 93 and to 1984, all pregnant women that were expected to give birth between May 1983 to April 1984 were invited into the study. And from those, we had 3327 women who participated. And from the 3327 women, we had 3080 singleton live births. So at the start of the study, we excluded twins or excluded twins or multiple births, but they were invited back in the study in the later years. So the CLHNS sample from the 3080 singleton live births, we still had about 43% of them in 2018. So after 35 years, we have 1327 that were followed up. 1327 of the singleton live births. We have some twins also about that. So it's about 1343, including the twins. So the most common cause of loss to follow-up was outmigration. because we do not follow up anymore those that go outside of Metro Cebu, mainly for logistical reasons. We also have deaths, about 305 deaths among those that we have followed up. We don't really know those who have out-migrated, how many also died. But for those that we have followed up, we have information, 305 deaths, and also 180 refusals and other reasons such as being institutionalized or incarcerated. So Linda Adair will present to you the selected highlights of the study results.
Thanks. I think you're going to see some commonalities from the prior studies. So despite the fact that we're working all over the world in very different environments, there are a number of really important parallels in our results. So we also focus on the first 1,000 days. In this population, about 11.5% were low birth weight, 21% small for gestational age, and consistent with the early days in Brazil, the median duration of breastfeeding was relatively short, only 2 months of exclusive breastfeeding. Overall, about 13 months of breastfeeding, and this was really the main focus of the original COHNS. It was designed primarily, as Nanette said, as an infant feeding study. And as you can see from this chart of Z-scores relative to the WHO reference, there were quite dramatic declines, in particular in the length for age Z-score shown in blue. So by the time the children were only 2 years old, 65% of the population was stunted. So this is very similar to what was seen in Guatemala. And we also found, and contributed to the important literature on breastfeeding back in the 1980s, that it's particularly important for children to be breastfed when they live in pathogenic environments. So in this graph, we're looking at the probability of experiencing diarrhea. And if you look at the red bars, you can see that back in the corner with very poor quality environments, including unsanitary conditions and poor water supplies, that the probability of diarrhea was nearly 40%. But in those children who were exclusively breastfed, the rates were much lower. So while breastfeeding was protective for everyone, it was particularly important for people who lived in the low-income squatter areas in the urban parts of Metro Cebu. In childhood, we administered IQ tests and found that they varied, the results varied directly with stunting. So consistent with many other studies, there's a direct relationship between early physical growth and early deficits in intellectual development. Not that poor growth causes low IQs, but there's a strong association because both are influenced by adverse environments. And so you see here, adjusted for maternal education and household wealth, there's a nice kind of stepwise relationship with the highest IQs in the children with the highest height for age Z-scores. And this was true also in their achievement tests given when they were 11 years old and had already entered school. So we see that dose response between early childhood stunting and achievement scores in English and math. In adolescence, there was a strong focus in the study also on mental health and on intimate partner violence and violence within the household. So this, as with the other cohorts that are included in our collaboration, is one of the few longitudinal studies that includes assessment of both stress and mental health, along with the other kinds of physical health measures that are taken throughout the life course. So we were able to show that depressive symptoms and evidence of suicidal ideation were increased in young adults that had themselves been exposed to domestic violence in their households. We also looked at parenting styles and found that they were associated with drug use in young adults. And by adding biomarkers to the study, we were able to show that markers of stress and inflammation were strongly linked with psychosocial factors. So this is showing the advantage of combining biomarkers and psychosocial and stress measures all into the same longitudinal study. As young adults, we found that there were very high levels of educational attainment in Cebu. And this is important relative to other countries in Asia. There is a higher level of achievement in females compared to males. So you'll see that in the females, in the turquoise-colored bars, there's quite a high percentage of females that finished high school and went on to college. And it's unusual to see that balance in Asian context where women are more educated than men. Schooling outcomes were strongly related to stunting. So in this graph, you are seeing that years of schooling are strongly associated with stunting in early life. And so the lowest attained schooling is in those individuals that had Z-scores early on, less than -3. And the highest attainment is in those with the highest Z-scores. And if we look across the groups, those individuals that had Z-scores of 0 or above, all of them went to school. So 100% of those with higher Z-scores actually had completed high school or more. We also find a strong relationship between schooling and employment. So if we think about that link, the relationship between early stunting, school attainment, and employment in the same way that Guatemala found this important association, we see that formal sector employment, which is associated with higher wages and also better benefits, per each year of schooling, females had an increased odds of being employed in that formal sector of nearly 60% greater. And for males, there's also a significant bonus, higher likelihood of formal sector employment that's associated with schooling. So the payoffs we're seeing in all of these diverse settings, from early childhood to schooling to adult outcomes. And then if we move into mid-adulthood, we also find, like Guatemala, that there's the emergence of cardiometabolic disease in the population. So cardiometabolic risk factors are already highly prevalent. These are data from the latest survey, and you can see that about 45% of males and females had BMIs greater than 25. Keep this in the context that 65% were stunted at age 2. Another 10% have BMIs greater than 30, which is indicative of obesity. High blood pressure, defined by the kind of classic WHO definition, already in more than 20% of males. And high waist circumference, particularly in females, with nearly half having high waist circumference. So we're seeing this emergence in mid-adulthood of these high levels of cardiometabolic risk in this population, where there's been very rapid economic change over the years. We've also done a number of genetic studies using the CLHNS, and we have contributed to a large number of consortia that have been looking at the genetics of birth weight, height, pubertal development, blood pressure, lipids, weight status. And so by contributing an Asian population, you see a lot more diversity in these genetic reports, rather than just looking at European populations. So that's, I think, been one of the valuable contributions by doing GWAS in the sample. We've maintained a dual focus. We're talking primarily about the kids here, but we're also continuing to look at the moms. And if you do any longitudinal study long enough, it becomes an aging study. So now we're looking at aging in the mothers and intergenerational patterns that can be followed over time. So by following the moms, we can really look at changes that are occurring over the life course. And we can also then look at the role that grandmothers have in the next generation in fostering the development of the offspring of our now 35-year-old generation. So just to kind of sum up, the key strengths of the CLHNS is that, first of all, it's been ideal for studying early life factors that influence multiple types of outcomes, including health, economic, and social. It's allowing us now to look at intergenerational differences, so we can compare the same behaviors and health outcomes across 2 generations. What are the patterns of breastfeeding in generation 1 versus 2, and now in the next generation? We can look at intimate partner violence in mothers and daughters and see the extent to which it's been perpetuated over time. In families where mothers and their offspring are still living together, as well as those that have moved apart. The key contributions of the study relate to the results that we presented earlier, some of the studies from the 1980s about the promotion and support of exclusive breastfeeding, the identification of risk factors for stunting. And so these have been very important in supporting early child and nutrition development programs. We really have demonstrated the importance of keeping kids in school, given the importance of schooling for better employment in adulthoods. And we've also been able to contribute more than 20 years of empirical data on mental health and stress, starting in adolescence. So with that, I'd like to thank our CLH&S participants because they've been very loyal and working with us for over 35 years and are still answering all of those questions when we come and knock on the door. We've had funding from the NIH, now expanding into aging, funding from the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, USAID, Thrasher, Mellon. As many of you know, it takes a lot of funding sources to keep these going over the years. So another one of the shared effects. OPS is just exceptional in terms of data collection and maintenance of high quality. And we've also benefited from multiple collaborations, expanded from the original UNC OPS collaboration to also include Northwestern University and Johns Hopkins University. So with that, I'll
Quick clarifying question. Well, we have Linda.
Okay, so it's IQ. You were analyzing the IQs. How did you come to the conclusion that the IQ is increasing or something like that?
So the IQ was the Philippine Nonverbal Intelligence Test. This is mostly a test of fluid abilities.
Oh, what?
Fluid abilities. So those IQ tests were administered in early childhood. So we see that kind of dose-response relationship between stunting and IQ. And those analyses are controlled for socioeconomic factors that jointly determine stunting and SES.
So do you only use observation and analysis and medical procedure anymore?
No, this was designed as primarily a sociodemographic survey. It added biomarkers starting in 1998, but it doesn't involve any medical examinations in the way that the law test has, for example.
Why?
Why? Well, they're very expensive, and this started out as a health and population study. The collaboration was with a population center in the Philippines, and the resources needed for biomedical assessments are just so much greater.
Okay, so you use different cohorts, like Philippines, other nations as well, and then you make this conclusion.
Well, the results that you just saw here were only from the Cebu cohort. You're going to later in the session be seeing results from all of the cohorts combined.
Okay, so this is a general conclusion. Like, does it work for? Do you think it works for other cohorts as well, or other nations?
Perhaps we could come back to that because it's a discussion.
Part of the
questions come up.
right.
Ari will.
Yeah.
Come up, ask that question in two presentations time.
Yeah. So when Ari presents on the
We'll see patterns
Keep the question.
across the countries.
One more time.
Yeah.
We'll get
We'll
to
get
your
there.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. So we now switch to the local cohorts here in Soweto, Johannesburg. It's the youngest of the cohorts. So it's 29, turning 30 next year. So 30 is our big celebration for next year. And Linda Richter will be speaking to that cohort, birth to 20.
Right, thanks, Jay. I mean, the subtitle of the book I'm writing on Birth to 20 is a study as ambitious as the country we were trying to create. I think all of these cohorts started out hugely ambitious with very few resources and are really testimony to the persistence of the people involved. So it's really interesting why we started the study. There were concerns about urbanization and health, and it was triggered by a paper in 1988 by Van der Merwe on urbanization and cancer prevalence, which I think was a surreptitious way of really talking about urbanization as a political issue. It appeared in the South African Medical Journal. And remember, at that time, South Africa was partitioned into white South Africa and black South Africa. Black South Africa were the homelands. white South Africa were the urban areas. And at that point, Coetzee, he's a demographer, he noted that the white parts of South Africa were 73% urbanized, so pretty urbanized, and had very low population growth compared to black South Africa, which were the homelands, where amongst whom only 16% of people were urbanized and a nearly 5% population growth. And he predicted that there would be massive population movement into the urban areas, particularly given that at that point apartheid legislation was crumbling, the Group Areas Act had been repealed, influx control had been done away with. And the question posed then, and it would have come through the cabinet, to the health minister, to the president of the MRC, was how would the health profile of people change with rapid urbanization? And with that, the government, the Department of Health, provided a large grant to the Medical Research Council to both start a unit of research on urbanization and to start a birth cohort study. So just to give you some quick figures, we ascertained there were 5,499 births during our enrollment period in 1990. We enrolled 4,029 of those, that's 73. We knew we missed the private sector health provisions. We did not go to private gynecologists, we only recruited through the 97 public health clinics and hospitals. We lost 19% of the cohort we had enrolled in the first year of the study, and so our residential cohort that we then followed up is 3273. Now this loss, I mean there are many kinds of loss. The initial loss was the non-enrollment of a largely middle-class white population, but this massive loss that we experienced in the first year was predicted by the pilot studies. So we knew that people would come into Soweto to have their babies. They wanted a Johannesburg birth record because that would entitle their children to work and live in an urban area at some point. They wanted to be with migrant labor husbands for the confinement of the baby, and they sought better health care at Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. So we knew that there was, as it were, a visiting population of people who came into Soweto, Johannesburg to have babies and lived very soon afterwards to mostly rural areas. We have had 21 data collection rounds, very close data collection throughout the adolescent years. We were very interested in changes in adolescence. And of course, the Birth to 20 cohort covers the full range of issues from economic, social, psychological, educational, and biological. And that was really because we were a large group of scientists from many different disciplines who were contributing to the conceptualization of the study and to its methods. That is our retention and attrition across the 28 years of the study, and much like Cebu, I thought the pattern looked incredibly similar actually. So for much of the childhood to late adolescence, we were able to maintain the cohort. Now we forget that these huge studies are about people, so I wanted to tell one story. This is a participant. The very first Birth to 20 baby was Valentino Miles. He was born to his mother, 40 years old. He was her 7th child. He was born minutes after midnight in an ambulance on the way to Coronation Hospital. He's still in the study. We saw him in the 28th year, and he now has a child of his own living with his partner. These studies are made up of incredible staff. So this is a story about Sabia. She joined the Birth to 20 study almost at the beginning as a data collector. She has received various training and qualifications over the 28 years she's worked there. She now coordinates all the study assessments using X-ray and DEXA to measure bone mineral density, ultrasound, PPART, infant body composition, and peripheral quantitative computed tomography. So she credits the study with her and her mentors for giving the opportunities to grow into a fully professional story. So in a way, the story of the study is a story of the people. Almost from the beginning, the study began to be known as Mandela's Children. The enrollment dates were April to June 1990. This was 40 days after the 11th of February, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison after 27 years. Birth to 20, in a way, became the face of the born-free generation, and today the born-frees make up 30% of the South African population. That is people who were born after 1994. And the book that Oscar Barbara and I did called Mandela's Children then kind of reinforced this idea of speaking about the study as Mandela's Children. And we transitioned over these 20 years from birth to 10 to birth to 20 to birth to 20 plus. And so like in Cebu, we have 3 generations. We refer to the mothers as G1. They're now between 41 and 76 years of age, average age of 54. And like in Cebu, have also become the subject of an aging study. We have G2, which is the birth to 20 children, roughly equal numbers of males and females, and we have the G3, children of the birth to 20 sample. One of the things I'm often asked is life better for the G2s than it was for the G1s? And so I just pulled out some simple statistics to talk about these. So G2 women are taller than their mothers by a centimetre. They have more years of education, so 58% of them have matric compared to 26% of their mothers. G2 have more things. They have washing machines. 72% of this G2 generation have washing machines compared to 16% of their parent generation. Refrigerators, cars, so on. Is life worse in any way? There are no simple answers, but like in the Philippines, we haven't seen a reduction in young pregnancies. So pregnancies to women 18 and younger, there have been more of young pregnancies in the G2 generation in our study, 33% compared to 27%. More young women smoke cigarettes, so the percentage of women smoking has doubled. The comparisons are complex, but we are looking at them. For example, do more G2 women, the birth to 20 children, feel overwhelmed by debt compared to G1? We have asked a question around life stresses, and feeling that you can't repay the debt you've incurred is one of these questions. And I've still to make these comparisons, but my impression is that this is probably an area in which life has got worse. I also think that violence at the hand of an intimate partner is also something that potentially has got worse, and reported feeling depressed is something. But these have got to be ascertained by actually going into the data properly. Now, when we were asked to focus on particular things, it's hard to do that. We probably have published the least number of papers of the 4 cohorts, but to select out of 350 papers and chapters what to focus on was difficult. And I thought I would focus on one methodological issue and some new findings on cognitive functioning from 7 to 28 years of age. I'm going to skip over the methodological issue on retrospective reporting because we haven't got much time, but I'll just briefly outline what the issue is. So what matters, facts or recollections? Now, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are reported retrospectively. There are 18 questions on events that occurred in people's lives before the age of 18. And they cover 3 topics: abuse, emotional, sexual, physical neglect, and family dysfunction. And there's a very convincing body of empirical evidence linking childhood ACEs and poor physical, mental, and social outcomes. Now, I'm famous in Birth to 20 for the adage that if you measure something once in a cross-sectional study, you think you have a brute fact. If you measure it twice, you have a reliability issue. If you measure time, you genuinely confront human condition. So, in birth to 20, we measured ACEs prospectively or contemporaneously and retrospectively. Now, this is an important issue because confounding factors may account for both ACEs and the poor outcomes, and the validity of any reports, prospective or retrospective, depend on memory, state of mind, concurrent and subsequent life experiences, and so on. Now, I'm talking about work published by Sarah Naika, but Mercy Manyema, one of our other PhD students, has also done work on this. And we compared the ACEs reported by caregivers at 5, 7, and 11, by adolescents at 11, 15, and 18, with an overlap between the mothers and their children at 11, and young adults at 23 years. Oh, did I go backwards? Okay. Our findings are there's actually moderate to high levels of agreement on household events and conditions. Things like unemployment, illness, disability, death, substance abuse, divorce, separation. Between both prospective and retrospective reports, between caregivers and children at 11 years of age, and by children and adolescent adults across their own lives. But extremely low levels of agreement on experiences by the child or the adolescent, the participant, the G2, on experiences of violence and abuse. So if we look at the same individuals reporting on whether or not they experienced violence and abuse, we have levels varying very much, with much higher levels of violence and abuse reported at age 15 and quite low at age 23. So we conclude that the nature of ACEs affect who report them and when. Caregivers, we know, underreport adversity and exposure to violence in particular. There's a difference between what adolescents report and what they remember as adults, especially with respect to violence. And adolescents may be particularly vulnerable to violence and or sensitive to affront and neglect and so on. So really we have to understand that the collection of data, particularly because we do so many cross-sectional studies in South Africa on social issues, that data needs to be looked at in the context of what Sarah Nyker concludes in her paper. They're basically existential reconstructions of childhood, subject to a life story that fluctuates over time. So we know from the retrospective and the prospective reports, they tell us different things. Now, there isn't time to talk about the results of the studies, but for example, retrospective reports are much better predictors of mental health in adulthood than on childhood reports. Now, the thing that I'm most interested in, and it's something that's come out in the other presentations, and I know Ari's going to speak about it with respect to all the cohorts together, is are children locked into their cognitive destiny? So I think we have a feeling in South Africa that sometimes people are locked in, and this is something that interests me a lot, especially in the context of household and school challenges. So given that there's so few opportunities to change your trajectory, what happens over time? What increases the likelihood, or what increases or decreases the likelihood of changes in cognitive functioning over time? So Birth to 20 measured what Linda Adair was talking about in fluid intelligence at 7, 16, and 28 years in a standardized way. Now, the distinction is made amongst cognitive scientists between fluid and crystallized intelligence, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But that is the Raven's progressive matrices. It's an abstract reasoning task. It's regarded as a very good assessment of working memory. And we looked at changes across this cohort from 7 to 16 years, from 7 to 28 years, from 16 to 28, and then across the whole period, 21 years, from 7 to 16 to 28 years. So IQ is highly heritable. The estimates are high. You get higher heritability with age, and interesting, you also get higher heritability with social class. So you get higher heritability estimates amongst higher social class people than amongst lower social class. And that's probably because the variation in higher class is greater, at least the supposition is, that there's higher variability amongst lower social classes. There's also wide agreement that IQ has these two composite elements: fluid intelligence, that is to cope with the necessary things you have to bring together cognitively to cope with a novel situation, and crystallized intelligence, which is the application of those abilities. So we now know that intelligence, IQ, is not fixed. The phenotype of IQ is thought to be significantly changed by low socioeconomic status, and that it can be improved by training or experience. So we examined these changes in fluid intelligence across these three time points, and the Ravens is actually regarded as an excellent measure of fluid intelligence. So we have a strong measure. It's the same measure in 3 age groups, and we wanted to look at how people changed over that time. We classified the participants into 4 groups: those who had an upward trajectory. So if we looked at 7 to 16, it was an upward trajectory or downward trajectory, which was half a standard deviation of IQ, so it's roughly 7.5 points. If it was the 7 to 16 to 28, they had to have had an upward trajectory in both time periods, or downward trajectory in both time periods, or they were consistent, meaning they stayed within the SD limit we put on it, or they were inconsistent. They were up in one period and down at the other. So this is the results we have. You look at them from down vertically. You see that in the period from 7 to 16, roughly children are distributed fairly evenly across those groups. Some are moving up, some are moving down, some are consistent, and some are we didn't look at the inconsistency because you don't have an opportunity to go one or the other way. By 16 to 28, you now have the consistent. They're pretty much on track, if you like, within their range. We see again from 7 to 28 pretty much the distribution sort of all over with respect to those trajectory groups. But when we look from 7 to 16 to 28, 57% have had an upward trajectory. That surprised me a lot. These upward trajectory groups are more likely to be male. They're also more likely to be male if they are downward. They show a decline in assets in childhood from 7 to 16, but they show an increase in assets, household wealth, a measure of household wealth, from 16 to 28. They're more likely to have a father present. The downward trajectory, again male, have an older mother, more child dependence in the home, wealthy at birth in 7, but poorer. So you see in the first group, the upward group, have assets, decline in assets early, and then a rise. This is a rise in assets early and then a decline. They start school late and they're more likely to repeat a grade. So the changes are large, much more looking at the literature than I had expected. It's to change 15 IQ points over this period is substantial. The changes endure over a long period of time, from 7 to 28 years. More than half of these young people have had an upward trajectory. So is this the schooling effect, or is it something else? Males are seemingly more susceptible to the environment or to the changes we've looked at. They go both up and down more than females. And we know that these different levels of experience at the individual level, so we put in a lot of variables that we have on this group, at the individual level, gender, at the family level, at assets and so on, and these are associated with the trajectory changes. Now remember, we're not only talking about environments, because children from high and low socioeconomic backgrounds also differ in their genetics because of their histories. So I think this has important policy implications. The one is the idea that IQ is dynamic, it's not static, it's modifiable, and it's not fixed. Now, I know Ari is going to make that point too, but it is an important point to make, and we show in this data that that is the case, and that fluid intelligence is clearly modifiable. The caveats from the literature and also from our study is, does this generalize to other working memory tasks and fluid intelligence tasks? So we only looked at it with respect to this one type of task, the task on the Raven's progressive matrices. What is the relationship of these two beyond psychometric tests, i.e. to real-life outcomes, education and occupational achievement? And certainly a big question in the literature is these findings of dynamic intelligence replicable amongst populations with wider ranges of ability, wider ranges of SES, and in low and middle income countries? So I know this is going to make an important contribution, not only to thinking about education and potential in South Africa, but also to the literature as a whole. Our next step is to assemble further data and to do some checks. Particularly, we are going to add a measure of school quality. We have the quintiles of the school. As you know, in South Africa, schools are classified according to the area in which they are located, and between 1 and 5, and we know that's not a very good measure of school quality. We can also distinguish between fee-paying and non-fee-paying schools, and we want to do this at 7 and 16 years. But we also have all the schools the children attended linked to the EMIS, the Education Management Information System, and therefore can get some slightly better measures of school quality, such as the number of children per teacher, qualifications of teachers, and so on. Once we have sorted this out in our own study, we then have an agreement amongst the cohorts to apply this approach that I call changing lanes to the combined data in the cohorts in Brazil, Guatemala, Philippines, and South Africa, looking at from 7 to, in our case 28, but in other cases much, much older, because not all of them have adolescent measures. But I think even this is going to be fundamentally important to look at, and I know Ari will talk a bit about it. So just to say, and I think I talk on behalf of all the cohorts, and I say we've waited a long time to be able to test hypotheses related to continuity and change in human capital over 3 decades in birth to 20. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. So just because of time and want to give enough time for questions, let's move straight on to Ari's presentation. So Ari will now try and pull all this together in some of the analyses we've done across the cohorts.
Try is the operative word here. Let me move away from the camera.
Do that live.
Okay, well, thanks for sticking with us. Good afternoon now. And I want to kind of bring a couple of the threads together that the other presenters have provided us some kind of really fascinating observations on. I want to thank Shane for the invitation to come talk. I want to thank everybody for being here. So I am going to speak a little bit about cohorts and about some analyses that we are in the process of completing. So just to give you a basic framework of, we think of the life course as having a number of check-in points. You can think of them, conception being the first one, birth being the one that kind of the Cebu cohort focused on initially, and then we have a couple more of the life course. One is the school readiness one that Linda has spent a fair amount of time working on. And as the cohorts have matured, we now think of adulthood as being where we kind of, so that transition from being a child to being an adult. And one can also think of influences within each of those periods that interact with what one brings to the start of that period, and therefore leads us to an expectation of an outcome at the next period. So complex methodologically, but kind of we all make simplifying assumptions in order to be able to tease things out. We've heard a lot about the individual cohorts. Cohorts itself is a consortium set up initially in 2006 to redress the balance that you can see here, which is that most of what we know about life course epidemiology comes from the global north, and the cohorts represent in fact, the universe at that point of what was available for life course epidemiologists to work with back in 2005. That universe has expanded a bit since then. The cohorts, as you've heard, all started independently, were all funded independently, all had different methodologies, all collected data at different ages and data of different types. The big challenge within cohorts has been to harmonize the data across the cohorts and try and reach generalizable conclusions. We've heard a lot of, what we haven't talked about here is the New Delhi birth cohort. The New Delhi birth cohort was started back in 1969. The reason that we haven't reported on it in depth here is that their cohort did not contribute to our most recent wave of fieldwork. But in some of the data, and much of the data that we have reported up till now, they've been a full partner. Again, you've seen a lot of these data in the individual presentations, just to show you that there is a lot of variation in height for age Z at age 2, from the Brazilians having very little growth failure to the Guatemalans and the Filipinas having a lot. There's also a lot of variation in attained schooling and in a wide range of educational and behavioral outcomes. some of what we've done has been to look across the cohorts, and I'm going to get to the question that was raised about generalizability across the cohorts. These are two findings that we have published on previously, and these have now been updated for a new set of papers that we're working on. On the left here you have height. So this is the increment in height in adulthood per standard deviation of height in mid-childhood. And what you see here is a very strong association, about 4 centimeters adult height difference per height for age z-score at age 4. A height for age z at a z-score at age 4 is about 7 centimeters. So kind of a strong persistence of the height correlation. Similarly for BMI, if you're an overweight 4-year-old, you are more likely to be an overweight adult. Can you hold the question? Otherwise I lose my track. Okay? And so I want to show these just as an estimate of how strong the prediction is from childhood to adulthood on something biological, right? Because we're going to move to other domains for which the prediction is not quite as strong. Just to remind myself that the next slide shows kind of something that kind of Victoria and Pilotas has developed, which are called equiplots. I'm going to show a few of these, so let me explain the first one to you, which is these are quintiles of wealth at birth in the birth household. The orange is the wealthiest quintile, the black is the poorest quintile within that population. Okay, so this is all, each population is done separately. And what we have here is the quintiles are arrayed on any number of outcomes, right? So on the left, it's height for age, z-score at age 2. And on the right, it's adult height. And as you can see, right, the poorest are more likely to have growth failure in adulthood. The wealthiest are the tallest, and the same is true in adulthood. I'd also like to point out that the difference across the quintiles is not huge. It's there, it's not huge. The difference between cohorts, between studies, is bigger. I'm now going to turn to cognition. We've heard a lot about cognition. Linda did a really nice explanation of what we're measuring here. Right, this is IQ measured in late childhood or late preschool. Right, so we call it a school entry IQ, and in adulthood, which we measured in all the studies in the last couple of years, so at various ages in mid-adulthood. As you can see here, there's a correlation. The correlation isn't massive. The correlation across this same period in height would be about 0.7 or 0.8. These ones are in the 0.3 to 0.6 range, which means there is a prediction from childhood to adulthood, but as Linda pointed out, there's variability, and we can try and explain that variability. Here's the equiplots for cognition in preschool and in adulthood. And here you can see the massive variation within each cohort by wealth quintile at birth. Right? IQ in every cohort is standardized at 100 with a standard deviation of 15, right? So this, for example, that's why they all have the same average. One of the questions we're trying to answer is the role of schooling in influencing adult cognition and the association between child cognition and adult cognition. So we all expect, right, that those who have higher cognition at preschool will go further in school, right? They're picked out by their teachers and their parents, they're smart, they're encouraged to stay in school. Okay? We also expect that schooling boosts one's ability to perform well on IQ tests. Maybe because you learn how to sit still, maybe because you learn how to fill in bubbles, or maybe because you actually learn to think. Whichever answer it is, you'd expect people who stay in school longer to do better on an IQ test. Okay? So what interests us is the incremental value of schooling, right? So does schooling mitigate, as Linda has suggested, right, perhaps, that the kids who start off at the bottom, if they stay in school longer, does it help them? Or is there a feed-forward loop, that those who are smart get more out of school than those who are less smart? Right? So these are questions we're trying to answer. And then because of the emphasis because of things that Ray has talked about and we've heard elsewhere about the role of early life growth failure in predicting cognition, do we see the same results for growth failure and schooling that we do for early life IQ and schooling? Hot off the press analyses. There will probably be kind of questions from you. These are not yet published, not peer-reviewed, but let's see where we go. Okay, so a lot of numbers here. Right, I want to orient you to what we have. So each color is one of our 4 cohorts, males and females. So there are 8 bars in each cluster. On each, these clusters are ranked by height for age z-score. So these 2 are the severely stunted, moderately stunted, kind of z-scores between -2 and -1, and no growth failure greater than -1. Within each cluster, the one on the left are individuals who did not complete some threshold of schooling. In Guatemala, that's primary school. In the other 3 cohorts, it's secondary school. And on the right, it's those who did complete that same threshold. As you can see, and the y-axis here is the adult IQ. As you can see, individuals who completed that higher threshold do better on an IQ test than those who did not, for the same degree of stunting. If you look across the stunting levels, there's remarkable little difference in IQ among those who did not complete schooling. And if you look across the same degrees of stunting, among those who did complete schooling, there's very little difference in adult IQ. So once you control for schooling attainment, there's very little difference in IQ. Right? At any level of child stunting, those who go on to receive more schooling have a higher adult IQ. After controlling for schooling, degree of stunting is not associated with adult IQ. And these results are highly consistent across cohorts and genders. Right? That consistency is one of the fascinating things that we see within the cohorts consortium. Doesn't matter where you are in the world, this seems to work. So let's now turn to child IQ schooling and adult IQ. Right? So here we get a different picture. The array is the same. The ones on the left, but the clusters now are those who scored less than -1, right? So kind of in their IQ test at preschool, those who were within -1 to +1, and those who scored greater than +1. Right? So this is kind of, on the left you can see kind of slightly kind of less smart. On the right are the slightly more smart. Again, within each of those, it's those who didn't complete school, those who did complete school. So let's look at the middle group here. This is the large majority of the population. They score within -1 to +1, normal people. Right? In this group of people, those who went on to complete schooling have higher IQ. Right? Let's look at these 2 groups. These are the groups, the one on the left have an IQ in preschool of less than -1, but they completed school. The one on the right have an IQ in the very much the normal middle range, but did not complete school. They have the same IQ in adulthood. The same is true at the upper end. These are individuals here, these are the normal range who did not complete, who did complete school, This is the upper level who did not complete school, right? Same adult IQ. So as you can see here, there's pretty much a gradation. Unlike the previous slide with the height for HC, here there's a stepwise increase. As you increase IQ, adult IQ goes up. As you increase schooling, adult IQ goes up. Right? So at any level of child IQ, those who go on to get more schooling have higher adult IQ. After controlling for schooling, child IQ remains associated with adult IQ. And here I'm actually using language I don't like to use because I'm an epidemiologist, and this sentence sounds causal, which is that more schooling can offset differences in adult IQ that are related to child IQ. Right? And again, the results are highly consistent across cohorts and for men and women. Linda started to talk about schooling quality, right? So here is an equiplot on child schooling. So this is the number of years of schooling achieved, right, across several of our cohorts, right? And again, you can see that there is a large difference. It looks like in Pilotes that difference has gone down over time. That's really interesting, and maybe we can discuss why. But in all of these cohorts, as one would expect, children from wealthier houses achieve more schooling, right? So I'd like to kind of wrap up and leave time for questions, right? So some key messages that I want to leave us all with here, okay? So the differences in household wealth in early life, those equiplots, underpin the disparities in outcome over the life course, right? We've shown differences in growth. We've shown differences in preschool IQ. We've shown differences in schooling attainment, and we know that schooling predicts later, so kind of these things build on each other. Schooling in this analysis is measured in terms of quantity and not in terms of quality, right? I would think and I would predict that if we had a measure of quality, that our differences that we have seen would be in fact much bigger. Differences in quality are wealth related. I challenge anybody here, right, to kind of refute that kind of statement. So they may make inequalities in outcome even worse.
Sorry, can you please repeat that?
Yes, that differences in the quality of school that a child goes to are wealth related. Parents who are wealthy send their kids to different schools than parents who are poor. It would be nice if it were not the case, but it is the case. I didn't say it's a good thing. I'm stating that it's a fact. High quality early child development, we know from multiple experiments around the world, is known to improve child IQ and therefore should be promoted. And Ray and I disagree on this final conclusion, right, which is an emphasis on stunting as the target for interventions, right, will not impact IQ, right? It's it will help, but without child development, you're not going to get as much impact as you might otherwise. So I'd like to thank the investigators across the cohorts. I'd like to the funders who are not listed here, particularly the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for our most recent work. And I'd like to take questions.
Right, so maybe if I could ask all the presenters to come up, and so we can, as a field, any questions. So you're welcome to ask questions related to any specific cohort, or in terms of the analyses that has now been presented across the cohort. Yes, I think so.
One more chair. Yeah.
Good. Questions? Fire away.
If I can ask from the Guatemala cohort, what is the key about the 3 years? As you said, Atole only have an impact after 3 years. Anything beyond that, it doesn't have impact.
Yeah, it's actually quite important that, because of lack of time, I didn't say that this study began in '69, but it included children who were born 7 years older, and it followed them till they turned 7, and it also included children who were born into the study and were followed till they turned 7 or the study ended. So I'm saying this because there were many kids who began to receive the supplement when they were 3, for example. They received it from 3 to 7. Some other ones received it from birth. So we could look at what is the impact in kids who received after 3, and what we find is that there was no impact on anthropometric measures, none. Which the policy implication is that, if you want to address, issues of growth failure, and here maybe we could start addressing a little bit of Ari's question. Growth failure to me is a marker that many other things, it's systemic failure, that many other organs are being impacted, including brain. So that it's very important, if you're going to have nutrition interventions, to make sure you have a good start in life. It doesn't mean that you don't do anything else afterwards. And yes, it would be nice to also have stimulation, but nutrition is important.
Can I add to that? One of the key reasons is because of the very rapid brain development during pregnancy and the first 2 years of life, and then leveling off. So many of the very basic pathways that add up to cognition later, like sensory pathways, language pathways, are all established actually by the end of the first year of life. So there's a real sensitivity at that point, because the brain is developing so rapidly, to environmental change and environmental influences. And then there's, the epigenetics. So the epigenetic changes seem to be also very rapid during pregnancy and the first part of infancy, which kind of set things on trajectories that are not unchangeable, but difficult to change. So this sensitivity in the first 2 years has been shown in other studies. For example, the adoption studies in Romania. So as you know, by government policy, large numbers of children were put in big orphanages. Children who were adopted out before 2 years of age tended to recover IQ and characteristics of brain function very similar to children who had never been institutionalized. Children who were adopted out and into families after 3 tended to remain very close in IQ and brain structural characteristics to children who remained in institutions.
Can I follow it up?
Yes, please.
Actually, I wanted to follow it up with you, Linda, with regard to South Africa. As you know, we've got a quadruple pattern of disease, and NCD is one of them. If you were, as a cohort, you were to bring a supplementation like Atole, which has some issues regarding the metabolic diseases, wouldn't it be a red flag for South Africa in terms of supplementation?
I think that needs to be a point of discussion because we're so much in the transitions. You know what I mean? And as Ray was saying, the stunting as an indicator is not only an indicator of inadequate nutrition or poor nutrition. It is really an index of the child's response to the environment in which they're living. So it includes infections, excludes exposure to pathogens, excludes lack of breastfeeding. It's a kind of multiple set of inputs, and it's not just nutrition.
as a follow-up to that question, then should we care about stunting that much?
Well, because it is an indicator.
It's just an indicator, but indicates complex pathways which are happening. So should we really? I mean, we've got campaigns that are focusing on stunting and making noise about stunting. Should we really care that much about it?
Maybe Ari can take one side and I'll take
Yes.
the other.
I think you'll find that we agree. Okay. I think Ray explained and Linda both explained really nicely that stunting is a really good comprehensive marker, or the percent of the population that is stunted, right? Not whether an individual child.
Okay, sure.
Right? It's not a good measure for an individual child, it's a really good measure for a population.
Sure.
As to whether or not the population as a whole, right, has a burden, an environmental, ecological, economic, food-related burden.
Yeah.
Okay? Right? South Africa's stunting prevalence is now roughly 20%.
No, higher than that, closer to
27.
Okay, between 20 and 30 somewhere, right? And with very strong kind of, economic differentials and rural-urban differentials. And so, those differentials between groups are important. They're, right? Is there anybody here who's a school teacher? Because the analogy here is for and this is where right? If you go in and focus just on getting rid of stunting, right? You would tend to apply a narrow set of interventions, right? That don't address the whole of society and the whole of human potential. Right? So my analogy is for the school teacher, it's teaching to the test. Right? If you teach the material that's on the test, you can get the kids through the test, but they haven't become well-rounded children. Right? The solution, therefore, is not, yes, stunting is important, but the solution needs to be multifaceted and not just focused on nutrition.
There's an exceptional thing about South Africa, though. A number of other countries have shown as poverty levels have gone down, Bangladesh, Brazil, and other countries, stunting has gone down dramatically with that. South Africa's stunting rates have stayed constant at over 25% for 40 years. And yet, there have been increases in socioeconomic levels, not as uniform as in some of those other countries. But I think we should really, I'm sure it's an inequality effect and we need to get to it.
So I'll give you my take. Stunting per se is not the issue, as we have been saying. I care a lot about the causes of stunting. And as Ari was saying, it's a multi-causal, If you look at the UNICEF conceptual framework, it goes into immediate causes, things like diet and infectious diseases, particularly diarrheal diseases. But then as you move to household level causes, to things like environmental sanitation, and you move up the level, in issues such as inequity, corruption, prejudice, there are all those things that really matter, investments by the state in health and education and so on. I was recently in Guatemala. Ari was there. We were celebrating the 50th anniversary of this project. And they also have a newly elected president. And I participated in some meetings because he's looking to what kind of program he's going to implement. And I should say with great sadness that the prevalence of stunting in Guatemala remains quite high. In fact, it's one of the highest in the world. It is now higher than that in India. And so there are many reasons, half the population is indigenous, it's marginalized population, the governments have been corrupt, several presidents have been jailed, and it's not because of money. The Inter-American Development Bank, in fact, in the previous two administrations, provided plenty of money. It is, designing the program and implementing it well. And stunting comes into that because for politicians, that's what you use. You tell them, look, you have 47% of children stunted. That's a high thing. And to reduce that, you look at places like Brazil, where stunting, came down very rapidly, and you say you need to invest in education, you need to invest in environmental sanitation, water, maybe you need a cash transfer program, you need to improve the health access, and maybe you need nutrition interventions in some areas, but not everywhere. So, but you use stunting as a way to draw in all those, and then you use it also to monitor how well things are going. And in Brazil, within 15 years, you saw stunting decline tremendously during Lula's government, and in other countries as well. So
just to unpack this a little bit more before we go into, because I think this is an important part to try and understand, because it's complex. So if I play devil's advocate a little bit, hearing the perspectives, on one hand, from a political point of view, having an indicator on a population level like stunting could be useful to kind of implement an array of programs. But one could potentially make an error by saying the goal here is increase in linear growth, as opposed to the concept of what stunting represents much more broadly. So maybe if we look at that point of view, is the goal to say we want taller infants or on a population level or less stunted? And does that automatically then correct everything if we just focus on linear growth with a potential more narrower view of policy change or interventions, given the data that Ari just presented across the cohorts? So maybe, Ari, if you want to pick that up and then come back to Ray.
So, kind of the other analogy I use besides teaching to the test is Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. Anna Karenina starts off by saying that all happy families are happy in the same way. All unhappy families have their own reasons for being unhappy. It's a paraphrase from the Russian. And so, growth failure, right, is multi-causal. And we don't necessarily know what the cause is for either for a given child or for a sector of the population, right? So it's going to be very hard to identify a specific therapy for an individual child if you don't know what the cause is, right? So, if one could identify a child, an individual child, at risk of growth failure before they have had growth failure and give them the correct intervention, we would prevent growth failure and therefore the prevalence of stunting would go down. We don't know how to do that, right? Except we know it at a population level, that if you provide economic opportunities, if you keep girls in school so that they don't have babies as teens, right? If you provide economic opportunities, if you provide water and sanitation, if you provide all these things, over time, the prevalence of stunting will go down dramatically. And it can take 10, 15 years. In the 4 villages in Guatemala that Ray talked about, in the 1960s, the prevalence of stunting was close to 90%. In 2005, it was 17% of children ages 3, right? Things can go down over time. We have to give them time to go down over time. We have to be consistent in our interventions, and we have to be consistent in our interventions beyond the life cycle of any one elected government, and that's the challenge. Because elected officials have a single tenure perspective, and there's not so much we can do over very short periods of time that will have that much of a difference. It's all long-term, sustained interventions.
Could I make a comment?
Yes, please.
We just did an analysis in the 1993 cohort about the conditional gain on height and on BMI and IQ at 18 years old and below. And what we saw is that the conditional gain on height in the beginning of life is important to IQ. BMI, it's not important, so important as the height. The question is, how can we make people taller and not so heavy?
So that's a good question. Good. Yes, we're going to go here and then we'll come to the side.
One of the most exciting things across the presentation is how these very robust longitudinal findings then actually do lead to policy shifts. I was wondering, as leaders of these studies, how do you balance the need to observe for 20 plus years, and then that will hopefully add to benefit for a very wide number of people, with how do you balance that with like the need to perhaps start to intervene with the cohorts themselves? And of course Guatemala's work is most obvious because you can see that the nutritional supplement was beneficial, then how do you then offer it to the control group? But I reckon that other studies have also sort of grappled with this, and I was just wondering, either from a scientific or even at a personal level, how have you made those decisions within the cohort? And have you ever thought that research is in itself perhaps an intervention of some sorts?
I'm happy to help, to say from my side. It has been a dilemma, and at several points we talked about interventions. But I also, as part of my professional research, as I run interventions in other situations. So I think the interventions are very important, but right now we are awash with poorly justified interventions scientifically. And so what has kept me going in Birth to 20 is to say that the science, and in the cohorts, the science is so powerful, because as you heard from the presentations, the whole breastfeeding for 6 months, and you know, the safety given to infection, and that in South Africa made a huge difference to HIV. The first 1,000 days emerged from this, the long-term economic benefits of an early nutrition. Good science has such massive policy implications that at a personal level you actually have to satisfy the intervention thing doing other things, I think.
And I would agree with that as well. And one of the things we can learn is about positive deviance within our observational studies. So we see a range of outcomes, and we can look for good outcomes that occurred despite adverse conditions. And those are the kinds of things that are most likely to work because they're working already in low resource settings. So for example, if you see that better maternal education has better outcomes, even in very poor environments, even in low resources, then that's something that you know can work in a community because you see evidence of it within the observational study. So I think that's another advantage. And of course, from an ethics perspective, there's always something built in to take care of people who are really ill and need referrals, etc.
So let's come to Ray.
Yeah, I just want to comment a little bit on policy implications and what's going on. And talk a little bit about this situation in Guatemala and this situation in Mexico. With this incoming president, many of us were trying to say, look, you know, even the impoverished part of Guatemala, which is Mayan, they have obesity, they have diabetes, you know, and you have to pay attention to that. But the national prevalence of stunting and is quite high. And the government, it just, I don't know, you get so frustrated. You say, well, what they're saying is, look, let us take care of that first, stunting, anemia, this and that, and then we'll get to that later. And that's absolutely doesn't make sense because many of the same interventions to address stunting also are appropriate for for overweight and related problems. A different example is Mexico, where it went through that phase about 10 years ago and now has a robust representation of interventions that start in early life and continue into adulthood. They even right now tackling the sweetened beverages and taxing Coca-Cola and Pepsi. It's a great battle, but in Guatemala it's doing nothing. So you have.
Sorry, hold that. Let's come over to this side. You had a question?
So IQ at school, I hate tests, I like so.
Can you speak up a little bit? It's hard to hear you.
So I'm trying to ask a question as to whether really school and IQ, the direct proportion or something like that. Yeah. So is it what happens when a child is not that academic, is not attuned or accustomed to a structure in which they probably ask questions or something like that? Does it mean that he has a low IQ, something like that, because of the fact that he can't answer questions, but he can solve problems outside school? Is it always school for IQ?
It's a difficult question.
What is the question?
The question is schooling always the criteria against which you test intelligence or could people who are not interested in school still have IQ because they have so much practical intelligence or strategic intelligence? It's a hard question to answer. It's now agreed that there are probably many more types of IQ than the two main types. The thing is that these things are related across the life course. So people we all know of millionaires who may, only had a standard 3 or whatever. Tony Factor was the great South African example. Yeah. So, but in general, people with more education get better jobs, earn more, and so on. And IQ is related to educational achievement. That is in general. That doesn't mean that individuals. We always used to joke about the two greatest world experts on stunting, who were Ray Martorell and Cesar Victoria, are both quite short men. There's a difference between individuals and...
Can I clarify the question?
Yeah, so clarify.
The way that I had it, I think I was asking about the instruments that are used to measure IQ, and if somebody is not, the child does not,
Yeah, but that's because we have different understandings between common language use of the word intelligence and research meanings of the word intelligence. In research, a construct is defined by a measurement. But in our ordinary language, we often mean very more complex ideas about intelligence. So yes, the instruments are kind of simplified. But there are many different kinds of instruments to measure IQ, but they always will be simplified.
Okay, so what brain qualities do we look for when measuring this? So IQ, I suppose you look for memory, something like that. So what cognitive capabilities?
Alan, he's an expert on that.
Your point is a very good point. I mean, I think what Linda's saying about the generalities of things, that things do tend to pull through in terms of abilities. But intellectual ability is now measured on many more domains than we used to think about them. And there's a kind of what you call raw intelligence, is what we call IQ. But there are things that people now call your navigation, called executive function, but your navigational abilities, which I think is what you're suggesting. There are different kinds of qualities which aren't exactly IQ, but are related to IQ, but they're different, which help you kind of navigate things through the world. And those are also very important, especially you grow up in terms of how you work things out, how you find your way, how you remember things, and how you cope, for example, with enormous pressure on your life, lots of worries and things, but you still manage to focus on what you're doing day to day. I think the issue of what happens in school and how you help children to bring out their best, the best in all children, is another point you make, which is a very important one. And I think schools, big schools with large classes really struggle to address that, but I think it's one of the biggest things that states need to think about that, so that kids at all levels have their needs addressed.
Kathy?
So I'm changing. So first, thank you very much. I so enjoyed hearing all these cohorts back to back. My question is kind of related to Abby's, not about intervention, but over the decades, were there perhaps national or regional or district interventions that you had to take into account or were able to use in your analyses and interpretation of the findings or the secular trends that you were emerging in your, I mean, Anna, you mentioned Lotus now being evaluating the Happy Children program in Brazil. Are there other examples of the cohorts being faced with interventions coming from outside or having opportunity to be used to evaluate interventions in the countries that you work in?
So in South Africa, for example, the question asked of us is, well, did the child support grant make a difference? As it happened, the birth to 20 age group just missed the early exposure to the child support grant. So that's not an intervention. Interventions, if you were doing like in Brazil and in the Philippines, they're looking at whole populations in geographical areas, then you could assume everybody was exposed to that intervention. In Soweto, ours is a date-based selection, and therefore they're distributed everywhere. Now, as you know, economists are always looking for the exogenous factor that will help you to determine cause. So we have an economist working on birth to 20 data and looking at whether the school riots in the late 80s affected the education and therefore the development of the subsequent children. Again, that has to make the assumption that everybody living in Soweto was exposed to the Soweto riots, which we know is not true. So, yeah, no, there haven't been. And also the numbers in our cohort are really too small. So people have asked questions about HIV. Well, actually, our stable cohort across the years is around 2,300. In those years when HIV would have, was really affecting the population. Really too small to make kind of study of HIV determinants and so on.
Shane, can I kind of tie those, because you also asked about the ethics of interventions. It is also true, right, the types of interventions that come out of the conclusions of our work are systemic, right, and therefore kind of, come after our cohorts pass through the age at which those interventions might be made, right? So, we understand the kind of the consequences of breastfeeding decisions once the kids are 5, 10 years old, right? We're not going to go back to those moms and tell them you should have breastfed or randomize them to you should have breastfed versus you shouldn't have breastfed. That would not be either ethical or feasible. So, I mean, that's in the nature of these life course cohorts, is that we inform the next generation, not the generation that we are actually studying.
And in the context of Cebu, there was a lot of informing the early child development programs that were implemented by the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. They affected kids after as well. So same issue there of temporality.
So before I come here, just Lawrence?
Can I also, I know or the Brazilian study had a higher height for age Z-score, and you indicated breastfeeding duration was linked to IQ. The other studies with the worse height for age Z-score indicated linear growth or HAS scores, height for age Z-scores linked to IQ. My question will be, was there any, and also breastfeeding was protected for diarrhea, but is there any relation between breastfeeding practices, duration, exclusive breastfeeding, and linear growth or height for Z-scores within the cohorts, either the pooled or individual?
I think our data supports the breastfeeding was positive associated with height. Is that your question?
Yeah, that's what
Yes, to height.
But it just seemed that Brazil had poor breastfeeding rates, but your height was actually better relative to the other cohorts.
Okay, so the problem there is you're trying to compare apples and oranges, right? They both kind of, right? So Brazil is at a very different economic level than Guatemala, right? Guatemala has very high levels of stunting, or at least had back then. Even within the Guatemalan population, right? If there'd been variation in breastfeeding, which there wasn't, all the kids were breastfeeding, right? We would have expected breastfeeding to be protective against even more severe growth failure, right? As was seen in Cebu, right? So you can have these two things coexisting at the same time. You can have differences in group mean height for HC, and then within each of the cohorts you could see a relationship between factors that promote better growth or promote growth failure, such as breastfeeding, right? It's also, right, and you know, it's just, that's, in epidemiologic terms, that would be a question of the same pattern across sites, right? But if you don't know which site things come from, you could end up with a really strange understanding bias through confounding.
Yes, my question, thanks for the insights on this topic. My question is around the study that was done in the two different villages. I think if I understood your experiment, it was more like looking at how certain products did help the growth cycle of certain participants in your study. I just wanted to know, has a different approach been taken of actually looking at how breastfeeding actually, how you get different set of results if you used breastfeeding as a case study as opposed to the products that you took a study on?
If I understood the question, you know, first of all, the Guatemalan study was not a program. It was done for scientific reasons. In these communities at this time, breastfeeding was fairly universal. It was almost universal. It was rare that a child would not be breastfed, and the median age of breastfeeding, median duration of breastfeeding was around 15 months. So they were already breastfeeding. And the supplements, there was really, you know, the consumption started after 6. You know, mothers began to provide them. And so it was, you know, it was, the supplements were provided to populations that continued to breastfeed.
So let me follow up on that. I think in terms of, could one do a study where you randomize either populations or individual women and their babies to breastfeed or not? That would be totally unethical, right? So there actually has been a study 20 years ago that randomized pregnant women to information about breastfeeding and the benefits of breastfeeding or not, right? So the community controls, right, got what, so, and then followed the children up, right? But that's as close as you can get to an intervention around breastfeeding, because to try and randomize a woman to not breastfeed a baby would be completely unethical.
There is, I mean, there are some studies that look at, in the context of prematurity in ICUs, where breast milk has been tested against, you know, the standard treatment, and breast milk is great.
But really, the INCAP study was a nutrient supplement beyond breastfeeding. At least 6 months was predominantly breastfed, and then you introduce a further nutrient supplement.
Right, and women continue to breastfeed till about, you know, 50. The median age of breastfeeding did not change.
And the women could also consume the supplement.
Correct.
Right, so the children could get the benefit through breastfeeding.
Improve maternal nutrition as well as themselves. Well, thank you very much. We're going to bring this to a close, but we are going to have lunch downstairs in the Antler Museum, so you're very welcome to pick up questions with the panel. So you can come down and have lunch and continue asking questions and pick up further conversations. So lastly, thank you so much for attending. Thank you very much to all the presenters for flying many miles and kilometers to get here. And of course, the participants have contributed incredible data for like many, many plus years on the recruitment study. Thank you very much.